My name is David Graysboard. I'm from Judaic Studies at the U of A, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Ralph and Sally Duchin Campus Lecture Series in Judaic Studies, made possible by the generosity of Ralph Duchin of blessed memory and Sally Duchin. A word of thanks to our outreach coordinator par excellence, Jackie Schmidt, for all the logistical, technical, and publicity work that she's done to put this series together. Also a word of thanks to Martha Castleberry, who's in charge of all the financial aspects, record keeping and so forth. Without people like Jackie and Martha, Judaic Studies would be dead in the water, as would the university. So thank you. Before I introduce today's speaker and today's lecture, I wanted to give you some information. We have coming attractions. One attraction specifically I want to focus on. That will be Sunday, March the 14th from 3 to 4 p.m. via Zoom, that is online. Judaic Studies will be presenting the Jeffrey Plevin Memorial Lecture. The lecture will be delivered by Dr. Erica Falk, who is program director of the Israel Institute. The Israel Institute is an institute in Washington, D.C. that is in charge of promoting Israel-related scholarship and Israeli scholars in American institutions, specifically colleges and universities. Dr. Falk's talk will be on gender inequality and in Judaic Studies, gender inequality in Judaic Studies. You need to register for that, so look for our information online. You can Google us. You can, if you're already on our mailing list, you will receive the links for registration. Today's Duchin talk will probably take about 40 minutes. I'd say the presentation will take about 40 minutes, give or take. Afterward, we will open this up to Q&A from the audience. And I want to alert you to the fact that we will be taking the questions in written form. So you should type your questions by clicking on the Q&A tab or icon at the very bottom of your Zoom screen. Okay, please keep your questions brief so we can accommodate as many as possible. Now, the main plate, if you will. Dr. Gila Silverman, our speaker today, she's a scholar of medical anthropology. She is director of Jewish lifelong learning at the Siegal Lifelong Learning Program of Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. She has conducted academic investigations at the Hadassah Brandeis Institute and also as a longtime affiliate of Judaic Studies at the U of A. Her subjects of research expertise include Jewish prayer for healing, American Jewish identity, and the impact of gender on careers in Jewish studies and Israel studies. She's currently involved in research projects that have to do with chaplaincy education and Jewish religious environmentalism. Let me say something that I've probably mentioned to her a couple of times, which is that if there were jobs out there, job ads for public intellectuals, then she would probably be a household name by now. Today's talk is entitled, May You Be Comforted, an Anthropological Look at Jewish Mourning. Okay, so Gila, please take it away. The floor is yours. You can open up your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you, David, for that introduction. And yes, you have mentioned that to me several times in the past. And I think the discussion then was, how does one get a salary for being a public intellectual? So when you figure that out, let me know. So I am really happy to be here today. I just want to say, yes, I am working now for Case Western Reserve, but I am still in Tucson, thanks to COVID. I am working remotely from here. So I tell people I spend my days in Ohio and then I come home to Tucson in the evening. I'm really delighted to be here to speak with you all today. I was just looking at the participant list. I see a lot of familiar names and friends who are joining us, and it's really lovely. I wish I could see you all. I'm staring at the computer. And I wish I could see your faces, but that time will come too. So thank you, first of all, to Ed Wright for inviting me to give this talk, to Jackie, as David mentioned, for all of the logistical helps, and to David for moderating. And thank you in general to the Center for Judaic Studies for all of the support over the last few years, which included helping me get to several conferences where I was able to develop the ideas that I'm going to share with you today. So I am, before I start, I'm going to share my screen. I have put together a few slides. Whoops. We're going to get this started. Okay, so I've put together a few slides so that you have, these are not going to be dense with information. These are more just to give you something to look at instead of just my face, as happens on Zoom. So I want to begin with a story, as I often like to do. 4 years ago, after my mother's death, my family observed the traditional Jewish Shiva week, the week of mourning, at my parents' house in Massachusetts. As tradition dictated, we left the door open so people could come in, and because we thought this might confuse some of our non-Jewish friends, including the local mailman who often came to the house, we put this sign on the door with some instructions. As the week went on, we noticed that despite the sign, people behaved in very, very different ways when they came into the house. Some people came and left very quickly, nodding gently if we happened to catch their eye, but being quiet the entire time. Others felt that they seemed to us to feel that they hadn't fulfilled their obligation until they spoke with one of the family members or told us a very particular story or memory about my mom. Some people, quite a lot actually, showed up with coffee cake and fruit bowls, and others signed up on a private list that was put together to bring meals. Some people ate the food that was put out every evening, and other people intentionally avoided it, leaving it for us. And I will add that most of the food that came into the house, we didn't actually want. Much of it we couldn't eat. We had something like 15 coffee cakes one night, and we're a family of diabetics and gluten intolerant people. So it was a challenge, all of this arriving at the house. Some people showed up just for the minyan, for the prayer service, to make sure we had the 10 people we needed to be able to say the morning prayers, while others came early and stayed late, visiting and chatting with each other throughout the evening. One evening, my brother and I were explaining these observations to our friends, and someone said, "We have no shared culture." So I'm an anthropologist, right? I study culture, and I had spent the previous 3 years writing a dissertation about all of the different ways that American Jews find meaning and negotiate with Jewish tradition. So of course, this comment caught my attention. I was particularly struck by it because the people coming into our house that week came from what I thought of as fairly similar Jewish backgrounds. Yet this friend was right. There was no clear shared set of expectations about how to behave at the Shiva house, of what the visitors' obligations were, of what kind of food they should bring, and of what you call the food. I chose this picture because it reminded me of the debates about kugel versus kegel, right? If you know your Yiddish, what kind of food to bring, what to call it, all of these things. And they certainly weren't clear. There was no one clear set of expectations about how to interact and care for the mourners. When I returned to Tucson a few weeks later, this became even more clear to me. I was surprised that many of my friends were themselves surprised that our non-Orthodox family had set Shiva for a full week. Many couldn't relate to my stories about the overflowing living room and the overflowing fridge. People were happy to support me by making a minyan once or twice, but most didn't realize that I would want a minyan for 11 months to fulfill what I thought of as my Kaddish obligation. As my friend back home in Lexington had noted, we had a shared culture, but we also didn't. Now, I didn't know it then, but that Shiva Week was the beginning of a new research project. I resisted at first, but my friend's comment stuck with me as I moved through that year of mourning. I continued exploring it over the last few years in a project that expanded to include traditional Jewish texts, published memoirs and blogs, ethnographic observations, informal interviews, and cross-cultural analysis. Most of what I'm going to share with you today is from this article, this article that just came out a couple of weeks ago, actually online. which was published in the journal Death Studies. And I will provide a link to this at the end of the talk for those who are interested in reading the full article. I want to note that I'm not going into detail. I'm not going to go into detail today about specific mourning rituals, but I do describe them more fully in the article, and I'll also give you a couple of resources if you want to look into them more fully. So first, I want to look at the way Jewish traditions connect and reflect to what we know about the psychology of grief. As some of you who are here today know, my mother, and that's my mom on the left, my mom, Phyllis Silverman, was a grief researcher. She spent 50 years conducting research with the bereaved and developing programs to support the grieving, including the very first widow-to-widow program in 1969, and later the Children's Room, a center for grieving children in Arlington, Massachusetts. She always had told us that Jews do grief right. But since her research didn't focus on religion, this wasn't something she ever wrote or talked about much in her professional life. Over the last few years, I've started to understand better and to explore what she meant by this. Psychologists used to think that the goal of grief was to, quote, to move on, and for grief to resolve itself, for the bereaved person to fully disconnect from the person who had died. This process of disconnecting was something that was done by the individual in private, and if needed, with professional help. In 1996, my mother and her colleagues Dennis Glass and Steve Nickman published an edited book called Continuing Bonds. That's the cover of the book. Building on decades of their own separate research projects, they called for a new understanding of grief, one that recognized that people did not disconnect from loved ones who had died. Rather, we accommodate to loss by building a different and ongoing relationship with someone who is no longer physically present. They recognized that too many people thought they were grieving wrong because they continued to remember and think about and incorporate the deceased into their lives through rituals and routines and creative expressions. In the 25 years since the book was published, their work has completely changed how psychologists and grief researchers think about grief. And this other book cover here is an updated or a continuing discussion of Continuing Bonds that was published in 2017 that explores more fully all of the different influences that this theory has had on the field. And I will add, unfortunately, one thing that has happened is that this changed the way grief researchers think, but it has yet to filter down in many ways into popular culture. From a psychological perspective, the researchers now understand mourning as a process of meaning making, as addressing changing psychosocial needs and cultivating continuing bonds within the context of a transformed relationship. Researchers acknowledge that these processes all occur within historical, political, and cultural contexts, as the meaning of loss is negotiated both individually and communally. Grieving does not happen in isolation. Shared norms, values, and practices guide our expectations of how the bereaved should behave, of how we relate to loss, of the responsibilities of the community, and of the social identities of the dead. Jewish tradition turns out to be a wonderful example of a well-defined framework for all of these processes, guiding the mourners as they adjust to a new life and a new status without the deceased, and providing lots of opportunities to develop and maintain continuing bonds between the deceased, their families, and the communities in which they lived their lives. Judaism prescribes a fixed set of rituals and prohibitions for the first week, month, and year after a death. This is and this image was taken, as it says, from a funeral home, and it outlines the timeline of Jewish mourning. Jewish tradition defines who is considered a mourner, which is the children, spouse, and siblings of the deceased, how long they are considered an official mourner who should recite the Kaddish, the daily mourner's prayer, and that timeline is 1 year for children and 30 days for a spouse and siblings. And what is permitted and prohibited to them at each stage of the process. Now, some of these prohibitions relate to ritual participation, things that they should do, like say Kaddish. At other stages, there are things that they should not do. In the first part of this, during Aninut and up to the funeral and during the Shiva, they're exempted from going to the synagogue. for example. It also includes things like not attending weddings and concerts, again, for either 30 days or for a year, not buying new clothes, or not getting a haircut. One of my favorite Jewish traditional guidelines that I read in a mourning sort of a book of mourning instructions was the mourner is not allowed to get a haircut until someone tells them they are unkempt. And that's the exact word, unkempt. I think that has to do with business, but I'm not sure. So this tradition acknowledges that after a death, people need to both separate from and then slowly return to the social life of the community. And that in order to do this, they need to also be cared for by the community. Jewish tradition makes sure that both the practical and psychological needs are taken care of after a death. It gives clear direction to both the mourner and the community at every stage of the process. It recognizes that mourning is a process, that ongoing mourning is accepted, expected, and supported by communal norms, rather than a pathology that demands professional help. The week of Shiva, that first week of mourning, the year of saying Kaddish, and the annual marking of the yurtzeit, the anniversary of the death, serve as reminders that the memories of the dead are with us, and that this is how it's supposed to be. From before the funeral through the ongoing opportunities to remember the dead through Yizkor services, memorial services on major holidays, and the yurtzeit, the anniversaries, Jewish practices recognize that the living and the dead are part of a shared web of social and spiritual meaning. But what happens when these systems of shared meaning are neither shared nor meaningful? Jewish identities and practices in 21st century North America are fluid and flexible as people make their own choices in an ongoing search for personally meaningful experiences. Participation in organized Jewish life and the sense of Jewish belonging ebbs and flows over the lifetime as people synthesize elements from Judaism, secular society, and other religious traditions, each in their own way. Knowledge of Jewish texts and traditions is often limited, and Jewish authenticity and authority is attributed to multiple sources, including sometimes imaginary ones. As with other aspects of Jewish practice, most non-Orthodox American Jews view Jewish mourning rituals as a menu from which to choose those elements that they find most meaningful and most practical. And as with anything Jewish, there is not one single experience or way of understanding things. Some mourners find Jewish traditions deeply meaningful and helpful, while others find them difficult, irrelevant, or cumbersome. And most people experience a combination of all of these. I'm going to give you a couple of examples focusing mostly on Shiva and saying Kaddish. These are examples from my interviews and ethnographic work, but I'm sure that most of them will sound very familiar to most of you. The term Shiva, which previously referred to both a fixed period of time, 7 days, it comes from the word Sheva, which means 7, and the very complex set of behavioral requirements that structured the mourning experience, now typically refers to whatever framework is chosen for public expressions of condolences. And the image here is the candle. In a Shiva house, you would light the Shiva candle, which is a candle that burns for 7 days to mark that time period. Many American Jews do not sit Shiva at all, or they only sit Shiva for the first 3 days, as these are considered the most emotionally intense days of the mourning period. Some people welcome visitors only during pre-announced visiting hours and request that the family be left alone the rest of the time. In some communities, catered food is provided for Shiva, while in others, people bring only desserts, or as I mentioned, coffee cakes, expecting these to be eaten by the visitors while the mourners prepare their own meals. In a larger culture in which grief is still seen primarily as a private matter, the communal nature of Shiva strikes many as difficult and awkward. Many mourners do not want to be seen by others in the early stages of raw grief, and many guests do not know about or do not feel comfortable with the tradition of sitting silently. So we have, in many ways, a very basic culture clash. American culture values privacy and independence, leaving a lot of people very uncomfortable about so many people being in their homes, and especially so many people being in their kitchens. And I'm well aware that by saying American culture, I'm oversimplifying, and I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. That's just a generalization there. For many American Jews, the official mourning ends with Shiva, although some might continue to say Kaddish, the mourner's prayer, as required, either for the full duration of their time, or only on the anniversary of the death, or maybe just if they happen to be in services sometime. As I worked on this project and started asking people about their experiences of Kaddish, it was clear that for some people, saying Kaddish for the full 11, mostly for a parent, in which 11 months of daily saying Kaddish is required. For some people, that was a powerfully moving experience. While for others, they just said, you know what, it just didn't work. I wasn't always sure what didn't work meant. For some, this was logistical. Many American Jews are fully integrated into the larger society with work and social lives that do not follow the rhythms of the Jewish calendar, nor do they necessarily live in close proximity to a synagogue. Rearranging schedules and routines in order to accommodate the times and locations of a daily prayer service, a daily minyan, is often not possible, or at least extremely difficult. For others, saying Kaddish didn't work in quotes, for a variety of other reasons. The daily minyan might not be at a synagogue they regularly attend, or they don't actually regularly attend synagogue and didn't feel comfortable there. Some were just uncomfortable with Hebrew prayers in general. Others found the prayer theologically incompatible or ritually empty. They couldn't find a compelling reason to say it. Some explained this to me with a shrug. They had thought about saying Kaddish, didn't do so, and moved on. For others, not saying Kaddish was accompanied by a sense of guilt. They felt it was something they should do, something that a good Jew or a good child would do. And I'll add that often the people who said this to me about either a good Jew or a good child should be saying Kaddish and they felt bad for not doing it were people who were in almost no way religiously involved in Jewish life. They were very culturally Jewish, they had other connections, but they still had this image of what they were supposed to be doing. The people who did choose to say Kaddish did so in a wide range of ways. Some people said Kaddish daily, and I didn't say this, but you're supposed to go and say Kaddish at the synagogue in a quorum, in a minyan, and a quorum of 10 people. So some people did go to the synagogue and said it daily. Some said it once a week on Shabbat. Others, whenever they happened to be in the synagogue. Some made a commitment to attend services 2 or 3 times a week. Others took on other activities and called these their Kaddish, like participating in a sport or an activity that that person who died had liked to do, or committing to a regular study or meditation practice. I had one friend who read a poem every day in front of a picture of her father, for example. For me, I will add that my Kaddish involved doing this research and now giving talks like this. Some say Kaddish for a year, for those for whom they're only required to say it for 30 days, or for someone for whom they're not required at all, maybe a friend or an extended family member, especially if they know no one else is saying Kaddish for this person. While others choose to say Kaddish for a shortened period of time, maybe only for the week of Shiva, or maybe only for the first month of called Shloshim. So at this point, many of you who are involved in Jewish communal life are saying to yourselves, okay, yeah, that's what we do. Why is Gila stating the obvious? They say that one of the tasks of anthropology is to make the strange familiar and to make the familiar strange. So although this project began with a personal experience, as a researcher, my job is to take a step back and look at these practices from an outside perspective. A few years ago, I participated in an international workshop on anthropology and grief. I described this wide range of practices to my colleagues, and they were a little stunned and a little confused. Why would people be so committed to these practices and communities and identities, and also be resisting them, and also implementing them in such individualized and creative ways? And if everyone's doing things in their own way and interpreting them differently, they asked me, how is this communal behavior? Now, one way to answer this is to say, this is what Jews do. They have different opinions and debate interpretations, right? The Jewish people have a 2,000-year history of evolving traditions and diverse interpretations and arguing about how things should be done. But it turns out there's also another answer. As we worked on the collection of articles that emerged out of that anthropology of grief workshop, and this is what's on your screen now is the introduction that we wrote to this collection. My colleagues and I realized something interesting. So I'm writing about North American non-Orthodox Jews. My colleagues in this group were writing about other cultures from locations far from where I am. Some were writing about the meeting of tradition and evangelical Christianity in post-colonial Papua New Guinea, New Caledonia, and Tanzania. Others wrote about, another wrote about political memory after the Civil War in Guatemala, and another about infant mortality in Iceland and dementia care facilities in the Netherlands. But all of us saw similar patterns. Now, of course, not entirely, but the common threads were very clearly present. All over our increasingly globalized world, we saw people actively engaging in processes of ritual transformation, finding innovative ways to navigate between their personal needs and the traditions of their cultures. Responding to a death becomes a negotiation, not only between each person's identity and their social and family relationships. And anyone who has ever sat Shiva or has been at a Shiva house knows that family relationships are being renegotiated every day during a Shiva. But also the death becomes a site for negotiation around larger issues of gender and personhood, ideas about the body and the spirit, about political and economic power, and about religion and secularism in the modern world. In many cases, we also see traditional practices and understandings being synthesized with medical and psychological ones that characterize our societies. In fact, that's what I've done here today, right? By trying to explain and understand Jewish practices through the lens of psychology, I'm also integrating different discourses. So this, of course, raises another question. As our traditions mix and mingle with all of these other aspects of the societies that we live in, as of course they have done through the history of all civilizations, and as we each make our own choices and find our own meaning, can the traditions do what they're supposed to do? Do they still fulfill the psychological needs I described earlier? I think the answer is it depends. It's hard to mourn within the collective when the collective is not there to fulfill its role or to serve as witness. When I was saying Kaddish, people told me they didn't go to the daily minyan, the daily service, because it didn't do anything for them. Of course, that meant that many days there was no minyan, no quorum around me of people to say Amen to my Kaddish. And I could not fulfill what I saw as my obligation to my mother. And I want to be clear that I'm not judging this, I'm observing it. In fact, in a personal comment, despite my own best intentions to continue going to the minyan to make sure that other people had that quorum present, I have rarely been able to make that happen. So again, it's just an observation. Also, for example, another example, if the community thinks its job is to feed you and keep you company, but you are desperate to be left alone in your grief, you will not in any way be comforted by their actions. At the same time, I've heard from a lot of people that these traditions do work. We've seen this year how important Shiva and Kaddish are, as these were some of the very first rituals, Jewish rituals, that were adapted for online life. And you see here an image from a Zoom Shiva. We needed these rituals in ways that we didn't need other parts of pre-COVID life. Both before and during COVID, people talk about Shiva as allowing them to ease into the loss, helping them to learn about the person who died, providing a framework for creating the story of that person's life. And maybe most importantly, Shiva shows people that they are not alone at some of the lowest points in their lives. And also Shiva makes death a part of life, and especially part of the life of a community. Within a larger social context that still expects people to get over it and move on from their grieving fairly quickly, the year of Jewish mourning rituals and the ongoing opportunities to publicly remember the deceased send a very different message. Sitting Shiva and saying Kaddish can feel almost subversive. Someone I interviewed used that word. It is a way of making room for the deep sadness that mourners are feeling, which is not acknowledged anywhere else in their lives. Saying Kaddish, in whatever form they do it, creates a space for grief and a timeline for moving through it. It allows the mourner to connect with their memories, sometimes to use a loved one's object, maybe their prayer shawl, their talit, or their prayer book, or honor them in the way that they honored those who came before. Saying Kaddish signifies to the community and to the mourner themselves that life has changed and that support is needed. It allows people to develop a new routine and sometimes to find a community of support with others who are also grieving and are a few steps ahead on the path. Now, as I've said, the experience is different for everyone, but it's clear that gender especially changes the experience. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that. And I will admit that I am now going to editorialize. This is the slide. This is the image that showed up when I typed in to Google minion or mourning minion. Here's the image. We live in a time and place in which, for the most part, women's obligation to say Kaddish and women's access to these practices are seen as equal to men's in, I would say again, in the non-Orthodox world. But saying Kaddish makes visible the places where not enough has changed. In all too many communities, the only place with a daily minyan is an Orthodox synagogue where women may or may not be welcomed and may or may not be allowed to say Kaddish. For many women I've spoken with, the juggling of family, professional responsibilities, and saying Kaddish is a much greater source of stress than it is for men. If, for example, the daily minyan only meets at 7:30 a.m. and 5:30 p.m., as is the case here in Tucson, it is going to be very challenging for a mother who has school-age children to get to services at the right time to say the Kaddish. We've given women equal participation in Jewish life, but we haven't yet created the structures that allow them to participate. All too often then, the women I spoke with as part of this project, the experience of being supported by tradition and community alternated with a feeling of being excluded, their prayers and participation undervalued. Too many of our mourning minions look like this, the image on your screen. And I would say that I think we need more that look like this, not that are made up of Barbie dolls, but that have the diversity of representation that this artwork, which is called intersectional minion, that this reflects. So I'll end by sharing a wish that all of us can find ways to honor our loved ones after they're gone, whether through the traditional Jewish practices or through creating innovative adaptations of those or other practices, especially as we move through these grief-filled times in which we find ourselves. May we all somehow find comfort together and alongside all those who are grieving in our community and all around the world. I'm going to end there, and I will I'm going to leave this slide up for a couple of moments. If you would like to read both my personal essays and this academic article, you can find those on my website. I will say that that newest article is not there yet, but will be by this evening. I will post it later today. If you want more information about the details of Jewish mourning rituals, I can highly recommend these two books. Anita Diamant's book is a Reform liberal explanation of all of the details of the mourning rituals, and Maurice Lamb's is sort of the classic Orthodox, very detailed description. If you have questions and comments, want to be in touch, there's my email. And I'm also just going to do a little plug for my new position in charge of lifelong learning at Case Western. We have a really robust Jewish learning program. So if you want more information, you can go there. We can leave this slide up for just another minute if anyone wants to take notes, and then I'll take this down and we could turn to the questions, I guess.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Gila Silverman. That was fascinating. I see no open questions at the moment from the floor, so I would like to open with my own, if that's okay.
Okay, I'm gonna stop the share to make it easier for me, so I can look at you and not at my own slides. Okay.
Great, and thank you for sharing that information about your work and contact data. Okay. Listen. One question just came in, so I'm going to read it to you. Another question. Wonderful. Okay, so the first question is, what are some of the restrictions for the first year, such as not remarrying? And what are the sources?
Okay.
What sources are there for the law?
The sources for the laws. Okay, so I will say, wait, I'm gonna Okay, I was just rearranging my screen so I wasn't distracted. So interestingly enough, and so first of all, I'm going to qualify my answer by saying I am not trained as a rabbi. I am trained as an anthropologist. I've studied these things extensively, but I am not a rabbi. So in terms of the restrictions, there are a number of restrictions. Interestingly, remarrying is not one of them. So the tradition actually, and I also want to qualify that most of these things are not halacha, they're not Jewish law, they are traditions that have evolved over the years. They come out of different responsa, different questions that were submitted to rabbis over, again, a period of 1,000 years. And the rabbis developed these, the traditions and the guidelines, I would say. They're often treated as law, but they are not, most of them are not actual law. The guideline on remarriage, interestingly enough, actually says 30 days. So that once the shloshim, the first month, is over, remarriage is allowed. I don't know the source for that. I think it's cultural. I think is the case in many of these. I think it's cultural, not textual. There are textual sources for some of the prohibitions, but I think in that case it is cultural. I think it reflects marriage. I think it reflects the role and the place of being married in the societies at the times when the traditions were developed. There's sort of in American culture, there's this thing that I think comes from more from psychology, which is that, in the first year after a death, you don't make any big changes, but that's not directly a Jewish custom. There are other prohibitions. So during the first week, you're actually not supposed to bathe. You're not supposed to wear leather, any of the things that are considered luxuries. You don't cut your hair, again, for either 30 days or for the full year. You're not supposed to wear any new clothing that has never been worn before. So some people get around this a little bit. They'll buy something and have someone else put it on and take it off, and then it can be worn. You're not supposed to go to large celebrations. So if you're at a wedding or a bar mitzvah, I know a lot of people, the tradition is, you would go for the service and leave before the party. You shouldn't go to concerts. You shouldn't listen to music, live dancing, those kinds of things. And a lot of them come from the understanding that you are, you're supposed to, I'm trying to think how to explain this. I think it comes from two places. I didn't mention this, but Jewish tradition, most of the mourning traditions come from this idea. They're trying to balance kavod hamet, which is honoring the dead, with nichum avelim, comforting the mourners. And so these prohibitions are designed to balance that. You don't want to disrespect the dead by throwing a party, a few days after they're gone. And you also want to comfort the mourners. You want to allow the mourners to recognize their own need to separate and to not feel obligated to look joyous or to act joyous when they're not. And there's a long, long thing. If you look in the Maurice Lamb book, there are pages of detailed prohibitions and requirements, most of which we don't follow any longer.
Okay. Thank you, Gila. So there's a follow-up to this question from the same questioner, which is, what about covering the mirrors?
Okay. So covering the mirrors is a Shiva prohibition or a Shiva guideline. While the family is at the cemetery, there are a number of these traditions, again, they rely on the community. So what is meant to happen is that when the family is released from any other obligations while they're preparing for the funeral and the burial, while the family is there, someone from the community is actually meant to go into their home and set things up for them so that they come back to a home that is set up for mourning. That includes covering the mirrors. There's a few different explanations. One is that you should not be distracted by trivial things, right? So taking care of yourself, the bathing, how do I look? How's my hair? All of that is not supposed to concern you. And so covering the mirror is designed to remind you to look inward, to not focus on those outward elements. And again, it's also a sign of another interpretation is that it is a sign of a reminder of the what's the word, of sort of the temporariness of life, right? That we shouldn't be focused again on our physical form. The mourning process is to go inward. So that's the explanation for that. There's also during the Shiva week where you're supposed to sit low to the ground. And so often many synagogues have special chairs that they will bring that are very low folding chairs for the mourner, the family to sit on. There's often, in some places, there was a tradition that you would put chairs on their side and sit on those. That I do know the textual source from. That comes from Job. And there's a line in Job that when Job is mourning his children and his family, his friends come to sit with him, and they sit with him on the ground. It says they sit low with him, and they sit in silence. And so that's the source for those two traditions of sitting, that the mourners sit lower than normal, and that you were supposed to sit with them in silence without speaking. Was there another part to that?
None that I can see.
Okay.
So thank you. This
Want to
is
make sure I got them all.
from Professor Ed Wright.
Okay.
He asks, have mourning practices evolved in conjunction with modern secular views of the afterlife?
That's interesting. I think yes. I'm going to say yes, but I think also that some of the practices have been retained, but the interpretations of them have changed. So, for example, right, what I was just doing, the psychological explanation. So you have a lot of people who, the traditional explanation for saying Kaddish is that the soul is in, the mystical Jewish explanation is that the soul is in some kind of limbo place for up to a year after the death. And saying Kaddish, there's a Talmudic story about, it's actually a Talmudic midrash. It's not in the Talmud itself. It comes later, but it's attributed to the Talmud. But Rabbi Akiva encountering what he learns is a ghost of a man who says that he can't, his soul will never be at rest because he doesn't have his child has never prayed for him. And Rabbi Akiva goes and finds the child and teaches the boy to pray. And when the boy leads services and says the Kaddish prayer, then the man's soul is allowed to move on to wherever the place that souls go is. And this becomes the sort of the proof text, the origin story for saying Kaddish. So traditionally, the Kaddish is actually designed, the meaning behind it is that people, that the children can redeem the bad deeds of their parents and allow them to go into a more elevated afterlife by saying the Kaddish. So that's the traditional Orthodox interpretation. Many people today, if you don't even know that, and when they do know that, they say, oh, that's not what I'm doing. But people say, well, I want to say the Kaddish because it allows me time, as I mentioned. It gives me a space to grieve. It allows me to remember my parent. It allows me to feel connected. It gives me an opportunity to be with other people who are grieving. It helps me move through these psychological stages of grief. And I will say that one of my mother's big arguments and contributions was to say the stages are not linear, and no one should expect to move through those stages in a linear way. Everyone moves through grief differently, and it's more like this than it is like this. So I think some traditions have changed, but I think it's more common that their interpretations have changed. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Another attendee asks, you mentioned that American Jews have many diverse sources they may draw authority from, including imaginary or imagined ones. Could you give some examples of these, and what do you mean by imagined?
Okay, I knew someone would ask about that. So the imagined authority is, that's sort of my term. And what I mean by that is what I referred to earlier about, people who say a good Jew does this, a good Jew does that, or people more often in my interviews and this has come up in almost every project I've worked on a wide range of different topics. even now it's coming up. I'm interviewing Jewish environmentalists, and some of them will say, well, I'm a bad Jew. We're not talking about their Jewish practice. We're talking about something else entirely. But this idea that there's what I think of as an imagined authority. There is this ideal Jew or an ideal Jewish source, a text, something that people think they have to live up to, or that people think they have to, that's where our practices come from, or that's where the why we do something. And it turns out there really isn't. Many of these things do not have one particular source. Many of these things are not actually legal obligations. Many of them are, as I said, many of them are cultural. When I went looking, for example, the idea that women are not obligated to say Kaddish, right? So that's a big one. And it's a male tradition to say, it's a male responsibility to say the Kaddish. Women are not obligated. And I went looking. I wanted to know where this came from. What was the reason? And I always thought, I had always been told, I know that women, there are certain mitzvot, certain commandments, there are certain ritual obligations that women are exempt from because those obligations are time bound. And because of women's obligations with childbearing and child rearing, women are exempt from time bound. So I assumed that, and everyone around me assumed that the authority, right, the reason was because women are exempt from time bound commandments. That's why women are not obligated to say Kaddish and to mourn according to these rituals. Well, when I went looking, I discovered that actually saying Kaddish is not a legal requirement anywhere. A lot of people, they use the Hebrew word, they'll say a chiyuv, an obligation. Well, it turns out there's no legal obligation anywhere in Jewish law saying that you have to say the Kaddish and saying that that it has to be the men. It is a tradition that evolved and became legalistic in many ways because of this story of Rabbi Akiva and how that was interpreted and reinterpreted and reinterpreted. And then at some point, there's some beautiful texts there. JOFA, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance, has put together a booklet on all of different texts from about a 500-year period relating to women saying Kaddish. And you can see in there, you can track how this evolved, and you can see that there are cases from 200-300 years ago of women saying, I want to do this, and the rabbis answering and saying, or fathers. There's a couple of famous cases there of fathers setting things up so that their daughters could say, fathers who didn't have sons setting it up so that their daughters could say Kaddish. And the rabbis say very explicitly in these letters from 200 years ago, there is no legal reason why they can't do this, but basically it's a slippery slope. And if we let the women do this, they'll want to do everything. And so we can't let them do this. So that then becomes authoritative. So when I say an imaginary authority, that's some of what I'm referring to, those kinds of things. And I don't know, did the question also want me to explain all of the other sources of authority that Jews in America use, or no? Because that's a very long list.
No, there's no specific request for that. You're more than welcome to.
No, I think I've said enough about that one.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Here's another question from the same source.
Yep.
Do you think there is a potential in the medicalization of these mourning practices for some people to be somewhat forced into a functionalist mindset in which these practices either work or don't work? Thank you.
Yes, I do. And that's why I say work, right, in quotes. And one of the things that I, as a medical anthropologist, one of the things that we do in medical anthropology is unpack that term. Right? What does it mean for something to work? Work means lots of different things, right? In my research, my previous research that was part of my dissertation on prayer for healing, a lot of the studies on prayer for healing were measuring blood pressure. They were looking at hospital stays of heart attack patients. And I wanted to know what the prayer for healing meant to the people saying it, right? So I didn't really care whether their blood pressure went up or down. That was a byproduct. Many studies try to measure those things. I was interested in more in people's own experiences. It worked in some very different way. And I think that is that is very true, actually, for the mourning practices also. I've heard a lot of people say, I didn't mourn properly, right? And I think one of the lessons from all of this is there is no one way to mourn properly. The proper way to mourn is to mourn, right? Whatever that means to you. And so I think it's very easy for people to get caught up. And this is the problem too with like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the 7 stages, or it's 7, is it 7? However many stages, 5 stages, right? Where people say, well, wait, I was supposed to go through, denial, anger, I can't even remember them all, and then get to acceptance. And people say, well, I was never angry, so I must have done something wrong. And I've unfortunately heard a lot of people say that about the Jewish practices, is the people I'm speaking with, but as I said, my colleagues, when we were looking at this in a cross-cultural perspective, they also had people, in all the different societies that they were studying, real struggle that came up within these communities of people who said, we have to do it this way, and other people who said, I can't do it that way. It's not going to work for me. And I think that's where you get this tension both between the medicalization and the tradition, and also between tradition and, us as modern people with an emphasis on the individual, and these cultural transitions that we're in the midst of, and making it very challenging for people thinking they have to do something in a very particular way, or there's something wrong with them. And that's, from my perspective, I don't agree with that. I think you can do this in many different ways.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. The participant asks, I'm intrigued by your early comment that there is a continuing relationship with the deceased. It just changed.
Yep.
I certainly feel this, and my husband died 1 year ago. Can you discuss this further?
Happy to. I'm looking over at my bookshelf. I want to bring out books to show you, but I won't do that right now. So the term is continuing bonds. It was, this was that book that I had on the screen. The book came out in 1996. It was an edited volume. The first author is Dennis Class. The second author is my mom, Phyllis Silverman. You can find many, if you Google continuing bonds, you will find an endless array of things that have been written about this in the 25 years since then. And the idea is that for many, many years, Western psychological understandings of grief, which came out of Freudian theories and Freudian analysis, was based on the idea that and this is again another model, that you had to do things a certain way. It was based on the idea that you had to disconnect from the person who had died, that successful grief was disconnecting completely. And my mother and her colleagues were working with widows, with bereaved parents, with one of them was working with adoptive parents. They were working with grieving children, with people across a whole spectrum. And over many years, they kept saying, this was an example of people thinking they were doing grief wrong because they couldn't move on. They were still connected. They would still talk to the person. They would still remember them. They would wear their jewelry. They would wear their clothing. They would go to the cemetery. They would go to the activities that the person was part of. And they came to this is my mother and her colleagues, came to understand that this wasn't that the people were grieving wrong, that the theory was wrong, that the popular understanding of what it meant to grieve was simply not accurate to people's experience of grief. And they coined this term, continuing bonds. They wrote about it extensively, and it has continued to be written about in many different ways. And I think the question being asked here reflects what I said earlier about, that unfortunately for most of us, that has not really filtered down. And we still have this understanding that we are supposed to not be thinking about the person. We're supposed to not be remembering them. And that's just not how grief works, you know? And I think the beauty of these rituals, and again, I'm talking about Jewish ritual, but this is true of many, many traditions and many rituals. And if people are interested, I'm happy to share some of the other articles from this journal that we put together. There are many, many different ways from cultures all around the world and from many different cultures within the United States in which we can remember and stay connected. And it's different because obviously that person's not here anymore, but they're still with us in some way. And I'll just point out to you personally, right? I'm wearing my mother's necklace and I have her books on my shelf and I'm using her ideas and integrating them with my ideas. So I say to people, writing this article and giving these talks, this is my continuing bond, one of many, but we all have different continuing bonds. We all have different ways of doing them, different things, and they evolve. I mean, that's the other piece I'll add to this. My mother also was involved in a 15-year project looking at children who had lost a parent. And what they found in that case was that it changed over time, right? As the children moved through different developmental stages, their relationship to that parent continued to evolve just as it would, or not just as it would, but, much like the way your relationship with your parent evolves as you become older and as you move into adulthood. That was the same even with the parent who was no longer alive and present. So we need to have space for all of this.
Thank you. Here are two very practical questions.
Mm-hmm.
Quote, how often does a person pay someone else to say Kaddish for them? And how do you find a person who will do it?
Okay. I can't tell you how often, but it's common. And I think it again relates back to this tradition within Judaism that, and this connects maybe to Ed's question, right? About do the traditions change? And my response, which is, for some reason, these particular traditions continue to carry a weight, and people who don't do anything else Jewishly will still feel that at the end of life and after, that they want a Jewish funeral, that someone needs to say Kaddish. And without any understanding of why or what it means, but there's this sort of visceral sense that this needs to happen. And that traditionally this would have been done, that it needs to be done in an Orthodox setting, and it needs to be done by a man. So in a family where there are no male children or grandchildren, in a family where people are not Orthodox but still feel connected, or in a family where just people aren't practicing but still feel the obligation, there is a thing in the world where you can make a donation. You're not paying someone, that needs to be very clear. You're not paying someone to say the Kaddish, but you can make a donation, for example, to a yeshiva, an Orthodox school in Israel, and they will assign a student there, a male yeshiva student, a full-time religious scholar, to be sort of designated for your person. And it has to be specifically designated, so that, again, it links up to that idea that this is for the sake of their soul. And so that person will keep your person in mind and will say the Kaddish for them to 1 or 2 or 3 times a day, depending on the arrangement. How do you find this? There are often, I've seen ads in Jewish periodicals. I'm trying to think where I saw it. I think I saw it maybe in Moment magazine, maybe in Hadassah magazine, often in more Orthodox. Those are not Orthodox magazines, but in Orthodox magazines, you'll often find it. Sometimes you can connect with yeshiva in this country or in Israel, and they will have this. Usually it's an informal arrangement that you can make with someone in the Orthodox community. And there is a really interesting novel, I'll just throw this out there, by, I have to look at my bookshelf, Nathan Englander, and the book is called Kaddish.com. I can't say I enjoyed reading it, but it was a fascinating book, and it's basically about, it's a long, complicated story, but about someone who hires someone, and it gets very convoluted what happens after that. But it begins from this premise that you can pay someone to take over your obligation. It's worth a read. Kaddish.com by Nathan Englander.
Okay, we've
We're
come
at
in
4 o'clock, but yeah.
the nick of time, exactly. We're technically out of time. I want to thank you once again for a very, very enlightening presentation, not merely informative, but extremely incisive and thought-provoking. I hope that all of you who attended, and please again accept my thanks for your attendance. Yes, please, go ahead.
No, finish what you were saying, and then I want to say one more thing.
I just hope that we will see you again. And please think of Judaic studies as you consider your own work of charity, as well as where your tax monies are going in these COVID-stricken days. But go ahead, Gila.
I just glanced at the Q&A and the chat, and I realized there was a question in the chat from Sid Listener, and I want to acknowledge this because Sid asks,
please,
are the traditions among all Jewish communities Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi? I will say, I should have acknowledged that. I am speaking specifically about, American Judaism, I will say mainstream American Judaism, which tends to be Ashkenazi. And I am not speaking again I'm speaking about non-Orthodox settings. But the Kaddish, the Shiva, Yizkor, Yurtzeit, all of these are traditions that go across Jewish communities, but they play out differently. So, for example, the foods that people would consider appropriate to bring to Shiva would be different in each of these communities, or how the community might behave in these different settings, the appropriate place to say Kaddish would be different, but they do exist across the full spectrum of communities. I just want to acknowledge that before we finish.
Sorry about that, Sid, I didn't see the chat. Okay, very good. So again, thank you all. I hope that we'll see you again. Thank you once again, Gila, for very interesting work.
My pleasure.
I hope you will continue to pursue it in good health. This concludes today's lecture. We'll see you next time on March the 14th for the talk on gender and equality in Judaic studies. And bon chance, kol tov, buen dia, etc.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.